Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to theAnalysis-news. Please don't forget the donate button and subscribe and share and all the buttons. We'll be back in just a few seconds to talk about Belarus. On May 23rd, Ryanair Flight 4978 was a regularly scheduled international passenger flight from Athens to Vilnius, Lithuania. While in Belarusian airspace, it was diverted by the Belarusian government to Minsk National Airport, where two of its passengers, Roman Prostevich and his girlfriend, Sofia Sapega, were arrested by authorities, apparently on the orders of the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. The flight was escorted to Minsk by a Belarusian fighter jet under the pretense of a bomb threat. The act was denounced by the United States, the United Kingdom, European Union, NATO, and some civil aviation authorities as an act of air piracy and state terrorism, a violation of international law, including the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. The Western media hit the roof, denouncing Lukashenko as an authoritarian, pro-Russian dictator who should be isolated as an international pariah. So just who is Lukashenko and why is he now enemy number one? Okay, number two after Putin. For starters, Belarus is a landlocked country in Eastern Europe. It's bordered by Russia to the east and northeast, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the northwest. It has a population of around 9.3 million. During the days of the Soviet Union, it was an industrial powerhouse. Lukashenko has been in power since 1994, considered the last free election to have been held. He's been accused of many human rights violations, including a report issued on September 1st, 2020 by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights that declared that its experts had received reports of 450 documented cases of torture and ill treatment of people who were arrested during the protests following the presidential election. The experts also received reports of violence against women and children, including sexual abuse, rape with rubber batons. There seems little doubt that Lukashenko is a brutal authoritarian dictator, to use a phrase the Western media prefers. But why does Europe and the United States get so worked up over his abuses when so many other such regimes are considered allies? Now joining us to answer this question is Małgorzata Kubicka-Figat. She's deputy editor of the Polish left-wing website Strike, and she's a journalist for Tribuna Daily and an expert in Eastern European politics and the modern history of Russia. She's now preparing her PhD thesis on the Catholic Orthodox relations in the Russian Empire. And Boyan Stanislavski. He's a Bulgarian and Polish activist, journalist, editor, and publisher in the late 90s. He was active in the Polish left and later in the labor movement, particularly in the Polish Labor Federation, the All-Poland Trade Union Alliance. And since 2012, he's been editor-in-chief of its magazine. He's a contributor at Barricada or Barricade and at strike.eu. And he's also Polish correspondent for the Bulgarian National Radio. So, start with kind of the bigger geopolitical picture, and then we'll get more into the domestic issues of Belarus and regional politics. But the question again is, why are they making such an issue of Lukashenko when we've seen things like this, including even bringing down airplanes we've seen before, and it hasn't caused such an uproar?
The question is absolutely justified, as we hear as terrific news as the ones that came from Belarus, from many countries of the world. But I think that the answer is very simple. For Lukashenko's Belarus is right now the only state in Central Eastern Europe, and the only state in Eastern Europe, and definitely the only state in the northern part of Eastern Europe, which is not yet a loyal ally, if not to say vassal, of the United States. Belarus, under Lukashenko, has been trying to conduct its own foreign politics between Russia and the West, balancing possible profits from being associated with the Russian Federation and having good relations with the European Union. And definitely, being an American satellite in the way as the Baltic states are, or Ukraine has become, it is definitely not what Lukashenko wants to do. So the democratic opposition in Belarus has been supported for over a decade by governments of neighboring countries of Belarus, who, for both historical and very current geopolitical reasons, want to see another government in Belarus. So Lukashenko is now steering towards better relations with Russia, but what he definitely wants is to keep the power for himself and not to make, as I said, not to make his country yet another satellite of the United States. And that is why there is so much interest in denouncing denouncing his actions, in criticizing him for being undemocratic, and that is basically why the Western media are so much concerned with the fate of Roman Protasevich and other Belarusian protesters. Well, I'm not going to say that Alexander Lukashenko is a great guy and we all should look to Belarus as an example to follow, because I don't think he is. He came to power in 1994, as you said, representing the hope of Belarusians not to share the fate of their neighbors, which were badly hit by the neoliberal transformation started after the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's been now ruling for over 20 years, and I would risk saying that he became quite demoralized by so long time of being at the head of the country. And so right now he is also fighting to survive, to keep ruling Belarus. He really doesn't imagine his future outside of the country or not being the president of Belarus. So I know that some of the left-wing commentators even tend to think that he might be building a kind of a socialist state in Eastern Europe. Well, he is definitely not, and but nevertheless, we must say that he is trying to keep his state independent of the Western influence, and he is trying to keep his country balanced. Until last year, he tried to keep balancing between Russia and the West. And this is not something that the United States or the European Union would like. They wanted another Ukraine in Belarus. They wanted the country to steer definitely in the Western direction, which would also mean the end of Lukashenko's rule. And this is something that he would not easily agree.
Boy, and when we look at the situation, that gets triggered by the forced landing of the Ryan airplane, it seems to me you have to kind of parse this. There's the hypocrisy of the West. As we know, the Americans actually even forced down the plane with Evo Morales looking for Snowden. So this certainly isn't the first plane.
They actually ordered the Austrians to do that for them. So the Austrians, right, acted on the behalf of the Americans. So it's even, a cascading kind of thing.
Cascading hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But you also, Lukashenko is, as far as I can understand, I haven't been there, so based on what I know, you guys are a lot closer to the situation, but as far as I get it, he is a brutal dictator. Like most of what he's accused of, it sounds like is legitimate. So you kind of have to separate this issue about the right of the people of Belarus.
Look, I don't
hold on. Let me finish the point.
All right.
There's a right of the people of Belarus to resist against the reactionary regime. On the other hand, there's the geopolitics and the role of the West of manipulating these struggles.
Yeah, you're totally right. I think that this is the problem that I have with the West and with its foreign policy, particularly with Washington's foreign policy, because there's this absolutely justifiable grief of the part of the Belarusian population that wants to protest against Lukashenko, and I think that the reasons and the premises for that protest were absolutely genuine. The point is only that you got to look at it. You got to look at the bigger picture, right? Because in Poland, in Belarus, in Russia, in France, in the United States, in Canada, there is one reason after another for protests, for mass mobilizations, and we can talk about it until, to use the American expression, until the cows come home, right? And there are problems everywhere. Now the thing is that I'm totally for opposing regimes, brutal regimes, those that use repression, state repression, violence against, their own citizens. And this is the case in Belarus, but this is also the case in France. And this has been the case in France for the last 3 years. And I got to tell you that, I hate this kind of comparisons, but still, Lukashenko, brutal as he might be, and brutal as he is, actually, he never went to the brutalization of the protesters never went to the extent that to what we compare to what we observed in France. Okay, so I think we really have to have a sense of proportion when we want to discuss that. And of course, I do believe in the right of the citizens to defend themselves against repression, or to even defend their positions that the power doesn't want to somehow, the powers that be don't want to consider, right? And they want to protest. But there is an element here that we have to that we kind of just ignore, which is the Western hand in the whole of it. Okay, and when you look at this guy Protasevich, he makes the impression of being like a classical case of a regime change agent. All right, he's been he's been one of those I guess founders, if I remember correctly. Mokshata, please correct me if I'm wrong. Of the Nexta Telegram channel and a kind of video channel linked to that, which is based out from Poland. Okay, and then they actually apprehended him during his trip from Athens to Lithuania. No one's talking about what he was actually doing in Athens, and he was participating in a so-called Delphi forum together with a guy, with the former ambassador of the United States in Ukraine, Payat, I think is his name. Payat, I'm not sure whether people in America or, I don't know, internationally are actually familiar with this persona, but he's not just, he's a very important American bureaucrat, and he's not just a hawk. Okay, I mean, he's a guy who wants to take down Russia. This is his mission. This is his obsession, maybe. So he met with this guy over there, and I guess, and this is just my speculation, I don't have any evidence for this, but I think that he might have been the Belarusians might have suspected that he was carrying something from Payat or from other people like Payat that he met in Athens to Vilnius, where the leader, the star of the Belarusian opposition resides, Tikhanovskaya, and they wanted to know what that something is. So I'm not sure whether that they did actually find anything or not, but one thing is certain, they made him sing. And, once he was put in prison, judging by everything I read in the Russian and Belarusian media, it looks like he gave them everything. Like all the sponsors, all the connections, all the contacts. And then, of course, they made him go on the Belarusian TV and say all those weird things, which was totally North Korean standards. But this seems to have been, on the part of Lukashenko and his regime, if you like, a very clever move. Because it reminds me actually of what happened in Russia in the beginning of the 21st century when Putin was scratching his head, wondering like what's going on here, not being able to actually identify the players, the international players and the internal proxies of those international players. So one day he actually ordered the special task force in his secret service or the police to invade, to break in, really. I mean, there was no storming, but to break in the headquarters of the Russian Open Society Foundation. I can't remember exactly which year it was, but it was in the beginning of the 21st century. And they didn't steal anything. No money were touched and stuff like that. They just took the computers and the hard disks. And the next day, the entire Open Society was on Putin's desk with its legs widely spread. So I think that this was pretty much the same kind of thing. That's what they wanted to finally get to. I mean, who's behind it? And also, let's not forget that there's this story, which I initially didn't believe, but the more I read about it, the more convincing it started to seem. about the alleged coup attempt against Lukashenko and his family and some very important Belarusian bureaucrats, which was apparently stopped by the Russian secret services. So I think that Lukashenko, had he fallen during those protests, there would be no democracy, there would be no human rights and stuff like that. All the things that the Western audience hopes for after Lukashenko is removed. What would follow would probably be a wave of huge repression against Lukashenko. He might have ended up dead. I could easily imagine that. And against the many people that still support him, because it's only in the Western mind that when there are dictators or authoritarian leaders that they have no support. Everybody's against them, but they're still there. And Lukashenko, everybody has been against him since 1994, but he's still there against the will of the entire population. Well, that's not true. He has enjoyed for a long period of time, for 2 decades, he has enjoyed a lot of support, decreasing support, that's true, but a lot of support, and he still does enjoy a lot of support, not 88% like they say in those fake election results, but I think that I can bet that it's over 50% of the population. And also he does enjoy a certain amount of support, not only based on his policies, which are bad policies, and I agree with Malgorzata, but also on the basis of nostalgia and fear. People are nostalgic about the Soviet Union on the one hand, and also they don't want to end up they don't want to see the Ukrainian scenario, for example, happening in Belarus, or they don't want to be puppet states of the of the United States or the European Union, like Poland or the Baltic states, or Bulgaria or Romania for that matter are. And they don't want to be in NATO. And this is there are many contradictions which the Western media never presented. They're not even interested in this. But, to organize an anti-Russian opposition movement in Belarus is something super artificial, almost impossible. And, those attempts by people like Protasevich and the likes of him and the NGOs, sponsored from the beginning of their, from the point of their emergence, sponsored and basically funded by the West. All right. They are not a point of reference in terms of the internal Belarusian political process, which is a dictatorial one. And Lukashenko definitely has resorted to some major authoritarian measures, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. And, Malgorzata spoke about him trying to maneuver between the West and the East and trying to be clever. Well, I think he only thinks he could be that clever, but in fact he can't be. It's just fear. I mean, he fears that the closer he gets to Russia, the more his family and his clan and his bureaucracy are going to get eaten up by the much more powerful, bureaucracy and oligarchy of, that operates in Russia. So he wanted to kind of prevent that. And in order to be able to prevent that, he had to lean a little bit towards the West. But the West doesn't want Belarus as it is right now. The West, if it comes to the point of making a choice, they're going to put them, put a gun at their head, and they're going to say, like they said in the case of Ukraine, I don't know whether you remember that, but in 2014, the European Union said that Ukraine must make a civilizational choice, whether they're going to, be with Russia or whether they're going to be with the EU or the West, the collective West, as the Russians like to say. And Ukraine wasn't prepared to make that choice, that kind of choice. It was forced to make that, and you see what happened. And Belarus, all the more, is not prepared to make such choice. But also, the other element of fear is that Lukashenko couldn't go too much towards the West because he would have been taken down by his own army, if you like, which is almost, on operational level, it's pretty much together, like tight at the hip with the American, with the Russian army. I'm sorry for the mistake. At the moment, the situation is that he doesn't seem to have much of a choice. Now he's got to wait, and he's got to be very, very obedient, obviously, to Putin, who saved his, perhaps even life, if we take the story of the alleged coup attempt seriously. And obviously now the West has achieved the effect exactly opposite to the one it intended to achieve, that is to drag Belarus even further from Russia. Well, now it's closer to Russia than it has ever been, okay, from the moment of the split, of the fall apart of the Soviet Union, and it depends on Russia totally in terms of, in any aspect, really. And it's obvious to any thinking person that knows anything about the region that now the fate of Belarus is in Russia's hand and Lukashenko's fate as well, and that the events, what follows after Lukashenko will be decided by the heavy hand of Moscow and no one else. I think that that's the situation we're facing. And again, as much as I hate Lukashenko's political culture, his ideas, I think it's not the role of the West to, first of all, make the choice for the people who's going to rule there and what way they're going to go. And also, I do not quite think that this is necessarily a better alternative, because people tend to think that because Lukashenko is a dictator, everything will be better than Lukashenko. Everything will be better. Well, I'm not sure. How about you just go to other Eastern European countries, like Bulgaria, for example, where I'm from, and you ask them about the civilizational degradation, about the level of destitution they've been experiencing over the last 30 years. And how about you ask them if they prefer to have this and democracy, quote unquote, okay, that we have, or they would have preferred to have someone like Lukashenko, who is or would have been an authoritarian leader, his equivalent in Bulgaria, but would have preserved something, from the old times. And this is pretty much what now Belarus is. It's an open air museum. If you go there, you will see pretty much, the 80s. Like, everything is clean. There's like the public transit works fantastically well. Public services are available, free for everyone, and so on and so forth. People's, standards aren't too high, okay, because the Eastern Bloc was pretty poor in the 80s. But it's nothing in comparison to the destitution, for example, in places like Bulgaria or Romania, and the thing that they've experienced over the last 30 years.
Małgorzata, you said something interesting, which was that some of the left in the West, I think it's a pretty small fraction, but some are talking about Lukashenko as an anti-imperialist, a socialist. Talk a little about the history of that, and just, there is a lot of state ownership in Belarus, but what does that mean in terms of what kind of system it is?
Lukashenko came to power in 1994, promising people that they will not suffer the fate of Lithuanians, of Ukrainians, of Latvians, and all other nations of the Soviet Union, which faced neoliberal capitalism in its worst possible version. And basically, after being elected, he kept his promise and he stopped massive privatizations. So the biggest factories of the Soviet era were preserved in Belarus. They keep working as state-owned enterprises, and still factory workers are really a force in Belarus. Let me just remind that during the protests after the presidential elections, factory workers were the strongest group on which the opposition counted. They really thought that if the factories stop because the workers go on political strikes, then Lukashenko would be forced to give up. And however, the strike did not turn out as massive as they counted, and so Lukashenko survived. Nevertheless, there is one important thing you need to remember when talking about Belarusian economy. Belarusian state-owned economy worked excellent when Belarus was a part of Soviet Union. It was really the best time in the modern history of Belarus, and I even would dare say the best time in the history of these lands ever, because the factories were all integrated with industry of the whole large country. The money was invested in social housing, in building cities in Belarus, which so earlier was a strictly agricultural region. The money was invested in the people's welfare. But all of that was possible when Belarus was a part of a bigger system. As a state, as an independent state, Belarus will never regain full stability without Russia's support. They have virtually no natural resources. A big part of the country, in the south of the country, was degraded after the Chernobyl catastrophe, and so there can be no agriculture in this part of Belarus. Belarus is a landlocked country, as you noticed in the beginning. So without imports from Russia, without raw materials coming from Russia, all this state-owned economy will collapse. And even now, some of the factories are working more for, I would say, ideological reasons, so that they are not closed and is not demoralize the population, rather than for purely economical reasons. And Lukashenko, I would say a decade ago, Lukashenko realized that if there is no socialism in a single state, then definitely there would be no socialism in Belarus alone. And he began steering towards a kind of mixed economy, while keeping still the dictatorial, the authoritarian regime in political terms. He gave some concessions to local entrepreneurs. He encouraged the development of certain sectors. So, for example, the game World of Tanks appeared in Belarus at that time because, computers, all this modern software stuff, that was encouraged very much. Just like the leisure industry, like cafes, this tourism, all this kind of small local business in which Lukashenko tried to encourage young people to invest, young new investors. He thought that he would raise a class of local entrepreneurs who are absolutely incomparable to oligarchs, not from Russia, from the Ukraine, or even to the richest people of Poland, I'd say. And so you would get a kind of mixed system with the state-owned core, but pretending to be a European version of the Soviet Union. Sadly, this did not work, as it could not, because when Lukashenko started to take the interest of the business more into consideration, it was inevitable that he would not be as concentrated on the welfare of working people as he was in the very beginning. And a few years ago, for example, the retirement age in Belarus was raised. It is still lower than in Poland, for example, but the very fact that such a reform was possible left a devastating effect on the Belarusian people. And I think that also Lukashenko started to pay less attention to inequalities and to the fact, for example, that salaries in Belarus, particularly those outside of the capital city of Minsk, were not going up over the last few years, over the last decade, I would even say. So it turned out that on one hand, Belarus has kept the state-owned big enterprises. It's also kept the Soviet-style symbols. But on the other hand, it started to experience typical problems of a peripheral states where people are migrating from smaller towns and villages to the capital. When people are not happy with the low wages, and when people see that there is a growing inequality between those who are close to the power center, to Lukashenko and his circles, and the ordinary people. And I think that this sense of discontent that was growing very slowly in Belarusian was also a factor that contributed to why these protests were so massive. Because I would like to say that people who were protesting did not ask to destroy all they know, to rebuild a completely new reality. They basically wanted that somebody takes over the system that Lukashenko builds, but steers it into more pro-social direction. I had the opportunity to talk to some people who joined the protests, even though they had never been active in politics. And talking about geopolitics or about the risks that are connected to Lukashenko's fall, even telling them that Belarus could share Ukraine's fate did not really make impression on them. It was even surprising to me, as a lot of Belarusians have relatives in Ukraine and they are pretty familiar with what happened in that state. However, they truly believed that by walking out to the streets and changing Lukashenko for someone else, they would keep what was good in the system and make it even better and making it more democratic and more oriented toward the people. This does not change the fact that, as Boyan said, Lukashenko still has a base of supporters, and that those people who protested in Minsk and other cities are, I would not say they are a tiny minority, but indeed they are still a minority. I agree with Boyan that had the real, genuine results of the election been announced, it would have probably gave some 60-65% to Lukashenko. But you see, if there is one third voting for change, then it is definitely something big. Especially in Belarus, where for the first decade of his rule, Lukashenko was really called affectionately by the population as Bachka, so the little father, so daddy. And it was not propaganda. People were really happy with having such a leader, and the lack of democracy, the lack of liberal democracy was not something they would greatly suffer from at that time. However, I also think that people in Belarus came to a point when they thought that their system cannot collapse, really, and that it can be only made better if there is a more pro-social leadership on the head. And sadly, they are not really into geopolitics, and they do not really understand that if Lukashenko fell, then he would be perhaps changed by somebody who introduces hardcore neoliberal politics straight away. And it is even not a perhaps on my part, because I remember an incident last summer when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, leader of the Belarusian opposition, was participating in an economic forum in Poland. And she sat behind the table with a group of Polish politicians of government and the opposition. And all of them agreed that Belarus must undergo drastic transformation. It must be modeled after what happened in Poland in the beginning of the 90s. The woman did not object to that. So basically, that is something that will happen in Belarus if Lukashenko falls. And this is indeed tragic, because I'm sure that nobody in the protesting crowds wanted such a scenario. I bet that nobody wanted to repeat worst things in Poland, apart from those who, by saying nobody, I see, Boyan, that you want to object to that, so I can be more precise. Okay, there is a group of young Belarusians educated in Poland or visiting Poland on a regular basis. I know personally such people who are truly fascinated with Poland as it is today. And they think that by removing Lukashenko, you can get a healthy democracy and a more social state, and a state that gives opportunities to everybody at the same time. And that this just will happen. I know that there are people who think it is possible. And if you tell them that Poland underwent a period of real misery for most of the citizens, they say, okay, you had this experience, but you went through it and now everything is fine.
For them, everything is fine. That's very important, because they get very serious state assistance. When you're a Belarusian student or whatever, opposition leader, if you like, or an NGO member or something, you're going to get a lot of assistance from the Polish state. And for you, life is amazing. They've got their own TV station here, okay, which is slandering Lukashenko. That's their job. It's been established, tell me, Małgorzata, when, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, can't remember exactly. But that was
about 20 years ago, yes.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, right? And they've established this Belsat, it's called. And it's supposed, the only sole purpose of it is to organize the Belarusian community here in Poland around it and against Lukashenko, of course, and to pour money into it via all kinds of NGOs and other agents of regime change organizations and so on and so forth. So that's obviously one segment. And I think if you allow me, Paul, to elaborate a little bit on the composition, so to say, of the protests and who is for what. From what I gather, it's like, of course, there are those vanguards of the protests, and those are people who are on the payroll of all the American-backed organizations, and they are not very democratic, really. People seem to think that they are, but they aren't. Pretty much, you can see that in, if you want to see that, of course, if you want to see beyond the mainstream narratives, you will see that in Ukraine, those people that were funded by the US are not really the lightest bulbs in the democratic world, okay, or democratic values world, whatever. And the same goes for Belarus. You've got ridiculous people, Belarusian nationalists. Belarusian nationalism in itself is a ridiculous notion. You cannot really have Belarusian nationalism if you know history, some history of the Belarus. You could be maybe some kind of follower of German colonists. Okay, that's the furthest you can go, okay, by if you want to be a true, genuine Belarusian nationalist. But those people, the vanguards of the protests, the NGO members, the professional anti-Lukashenkoists, professional citizens, professional human rights defenders, and so on and so forth. And they definitely don't care. I mean, they would like to see probably Belarus going whichever way towards the West. And some of them believe that, and some of them are cynical about it. I can't guess the proportion, but obviously it was their job. Okay. Now, apart from that, we've got a large sector of the Belarusian youth that definitely did support those protests without actually ignoring that factor. Okay, the leadership and their ideas and so on and so forth. Now, why? Well, it's because they are naive. And I said previously about Belarus being the kind of open-air museum of the 80s. It's the same. It's the repetition of the story of the 80s in Poland or in Bulgaria or in other Eastern European countries. People thought that we're going to have socialism, but but we're going to make it more equal. We're going to have democracy. We're going to keep all the social benefits, the social system, the entire construction, okay? And on top of that, we're going to build some extras like human rights here and democracy there and so on and so forth. And we're going to have the entire decorum and things are going to be colorful like they were in the West in the 80s, whereas, in Poland or in the Eastern Bloc, when the economies were falling apart, they were gray and bleak and everything was somehow worse, okay, in general. So I think that they look towards Poland, they look towards Czech Republic, and they even travel there because Lukashenko is a dictator, but he doesn't ban traveling. Okay, so you can travel and you can go back and no problem. And they see the surface. And when you come to Warsaw, particularly to the center, and when you get state assistance on top of everything, of course you're going to say it's great. You see the skyscrapers and the subway, brand new, the pavements clear, the sidewalks clean. I mean, the cafes and bars and nightlife and all kinds of stuff that, of course, I think people in Belarus definitely deserve to have that. Why shouldn't they get it? But it comes at a cost, and they don't see that cost, and they don't see what kind of future the leadership of the protests, last year's protests, has for them as a surprise. And they don't know anything about what happened over the last 30 years in Poland or in the Eastern Bloc in general. They just see the West pretty much in the same naive manner as the protesters saw the West in the 80s in Poland or other Eastern European Bloc countries, that things are great there. And they didn't see the unemployment, they didn't see all kinds of stuff that are just part of the daily life of the working class in those countries. Even more so now, right, than 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I think that's another sector. And now, the difference here, which I think is important to mention, and one of the major weaknesses of Lukashenko, is that exactly like the late bureaucrats in the Soviet Union, they did not invest anything, and he doesn't invest anything in convincing, in this kind of marketing, okay? Because Putin, for example, him and his administration and the local governments. They invest tons and tons of money and effort, real genuine effort, to convince people that they live in the best possible of all worlds, and that European Union is just, a terrible place to live. And of course, it's exaggerated, okay, because they just focus on all the problems that the countries in the European Union do have, obviously, and there are some major problems, like, for example, Bulgaria being a country of, it's a third world country, really, okay, by all indicators, despite the fact that it's formally in the European Union. So they will exploit that kind of stuff, or violence against the yellow vests, for example, right? Which was nothing. Which was a major thing in comparison to even events in Belarus, let alone the kind of repression of the protesters against Navalny, for example, who means nothing, again, just to, throw that thought in Russian politics. And Lukashenko didn't do that. That's why those people were left to kind of cultivate this naive understanding that in the West everything is fantastic and Europe is great, and the West is the best. Okay, so this is probably the beating heart of the protests. I mean, that's how I imagine it. It must have looked like.
Is there no part of the protests that gets not does not want to be associated or under any kind of submissive position to the West? They don't want what's been happening in some of the other Eastern European countries. On the other hand, they don't want Lukashenko, and they also don't want, to be under. Is there a kind of progressive left, I guess is what I'm asking?
Well, that's on the fringes of the movement. You are able to find that. Unfortunately, according to the knowledge that I have, and Malgorzata, please, you could elaborate on that. You've got much more expertise than myself. But what I can see in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Bulgaria, not Eastern European countries, the problem of the left is that it models itself on the Western European left. And this is something that doesn't bring any results, okay? Because the understanding, the political culture, the general culture, if you like, is totally different. And those kind of things aren't just going to work. And I'm afraid that because of this self-isolation, okay, those self-inflicted wounds, politically speaking, that, the left in Eastern Europe have suffered over the last 30 years, it's just there is an element of that, obviously, and it did support the protests, but it's a marginal thing.
Let me just notice one thing. It is, of course, there are some groups in Belarus that model themselves after the Western liberal left, and this is a way to nowhere. I agree with Bojan, but there is yet another question. The question Lukashenko did a lot over the last 15 years not to let the workers organize and not to let any genuine workers-based left to emerge from below. As you can imagine, if there are big state-owned enterprises in Belarus, and if there are really huge centers of the working class, even in the capital, this could have been a fertile ground for left-wing social democratic or even just trade union organizers. Lukashenko Lukashenko does not want to permit that, and that is why the workers in Belarus are all supposed to belong to they are not. It is not obligatory, but it is well seen to belong to a state-based trade unions organization, which actually does nothing serious for the workers. Apart from some petty social benefits on for a New Year's Eve or something like that, and any independent efforts to organize were not welcomed by the factory leaders and I would even say that some of those people trying to organize the workers from below were actually persecuted. So were the anarchist movement in Belarus that emerged at the beginning of the 90s, but also were down. So basically, if the workers in Belarus wanted to hear now some other alternative program, not liberal democratic and anti-Lukashenko, but not liberal democratic, there would be barely no one to present such an alternative to them. And this is also, as I would like to stress it once again, this is a result of conscious Lukashenko's policy, who preferred to build up a loyal class of petty owners and the mid and small business class, and he hoped to build up on these people. Then, but on the other hand, he was absolutely ruthless towards some independent attempts to organize the working class. And so that is why now in Belarus, theoretically, we have a socialist party which is big, which has a lot of members, and which is even present in Belarusian parliament, which means really nothing in the state's political structure. But also, its role in the real politics is limited to zero. Well, they are there and they say that it is important to keep these and these social achievements of the Soviet Union, but their voice is not really something that Lukashenko would listen to. So, and if you ask about left-wing participation in the protests, there were the left-wing groups, but Boyan is right when he says they were on absolute margins of the movement, but not because they are not honest people. It is also because of the fact that there was no ground for the socialist movement, from the independent socialist movement to grow in Belarus over last decade. And indeed, some of the organizations also made those mistakes that Boyan was talking about. Were like trying to repeat the Western model of being left-wing that is prevailing today. And I would like also to point out one thing. At the beginning of the protests, there were also left-wing activists arrested. They were also put in prison, and also the organizers of a political strike at Belarus Kali, which is one of the biggest state-owned enterprises in Belarus, were also sentenced to prison for their participation in the protests and for organizing strike. And really, nobody in Western media really paid attention to those people. Nobody even noticed that there is a fraction in the Belarusian protest who is coming with their own program, who is standing for keeping the social state as much as it achieved and making it democratic. The Western media preferred to notice another tiny minority. Those were the Belarusian nationalists calling for decommunization of Belarus, so throwing down all the statues of the Soviet leaders, changing the names of the streets connected to communist movements that are still left in Belarus. So you see what are the priorities of the West. So they want to portray the protest as a liberal movement, which it definitely does not. And it is very sad for me to say that sadly the left-wingers in Belarus have prospects for the left-wing opposition in Belarus now is really very bleak, because as the opposition figures were thrown to prisons. Now in Belarus it is illegal even to show on the media a protest that was not agreed with authorities. So if there is an illegal demonstration and a journalist shows up there, then he is also guilty of a crime.
So if a journalist goes to a protest that wasn't sanctioned by the government, the journalist is committing a crime.
Yes. Yes, he simply
bad.
He can't show this event because it was not sanctioned by the authorities. And so I saw definitely if Lukashenko's regime was authoritarian regime before the protests, now it grew even worse. And at the same time, there are really little protests for genuine democratization because, as I said, there was no grounds to go for a workers' opposition, for a truly left-wing democratic opposition over the last decade.
Okay, listen. What we should do is needs to be a longer conversation. So let's wind this up for today, and we're going to do another session on this, and not more about Belarus, but also we're going to expand the conversation to more of the region, the whole rise of authoritarianism, and the role of the West, the role of Russia. So this is just the beginning for this. So I thank you both for joining me today, and I hope you'll both come back again soon. and we'll carry this on, because clearly this point, it's this part of Europe that is so much at the center of the contention between the United States and Russia, and certainly in the Western media, there's very little attempt to actually understand not the politics and the peoples of this area. So we're going to try to really pay attention here. Yeah, a quick last word, Boyan.
Right. So no, I wasn't really gonna make any particularly smart closing remarks. I just want to say that things are terribly bad. Of course, in terms of dictatorial measures, okay, that are applied by Lukashenko. But when Malgorzata spoke about journalists not being able to actually report on certain events or show live, make live sessions, on live streaming on various social platforms, what immediately struck me was the thought of the Spanish gag law, which I think is still in place, or at least I'm not aware of it being somehow dismissed, is that, for example, you are not allowed as a journalist or as a citizen, okay, to report on evictions. You are not allowed to do that. It's explicitly forbidden to record and play it publicly how evictions unfolded. So it's not unique to Belarus. I just kind of want to say that. But again, it's no excuse for Lukashenko. I mean, there's this saying I heard, I don't know whether it's American, British, but it's like two wrongs do not equal one right. And I totally stand by that. But I think it's very important for people to, be able to look at the bigger picture and not to let them be, get carried away and to demonize Lukashenko or Putin or whomever.
Okay, thank you both for joining me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. Please don't forget the donate button, all the buttons. And as I say, we're going to carry this discussion on for quite some time.